Again, I'd just like to welcome everyone to the ISCAST and New Zealand Christians in Science conversation series. I'm Sarah Wilson, I'm the Program Director for ISCAST, and I hope that you're all enjoying the current series on creation care in the climate change century. But before I introduce our speaker tonight, I'm going to ask Jackie if she would pray for us.
Hello everyone, I'm Jackie. I'm the Digital Communications Specialist at ISCAST, and I'll be leading us in prayer. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, our Creator and King, I thank you for this opportunity for us all to think together as your people about what Jesus meant when he called us to love our neighbours. I pray that as we listen to Andrew, that your Spirit work in us and move us to care well for the beautiful world that you've created. And I ask that you guide Andrew as he speaks and answers questions tonight. Help us, Lord, to love, edify, and encourage one another in our conversation tonight. All this I pray in Jesus' name, Amen.
So our speaker tonight is Professor Andrew Bennett. Andrew completed a Bachelor of Science with Honours and a PhD at the University of Melbourne, and he worked for 12 years in wildlife research at the Arthur Rylah Institute for Environmental Research. In 1996, he moved to Deakin University, and in 2008 was awarded a personal chair in landscape ecology. From 2015 to 2020, he held a joint appointment as Professor of Ecology at La Trobe University and a science leadership role at the Arthur Rylah Institute. Currently, he is Professor of Ecology at La Trobe University and Director of the Research Centre for Future Landscapes. He's had many inspiring sabbaticals, including study periods in Canada, Britain, and the US. And I have the pleasure in welcoming him tonight to speak to us. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm speaking tonight from Melbourne. This is the lands of the Wurundjeri people. So I'd like to acknowledge their traditional ownership of the land and their management of the land over many thousands of years. And of course, many other groups at places where I've worked and done research in Victoria. For me, a poignant connection with the past and with Aboriginal people, if I can, here we go, is here. I grew up on a farm near a little town called Woolsthorpe down in southwestern Victoria. And if you look at that top left photo, you're hard pressed to see any native tree anywhere in that landscape. It's a productive farming landscape. Some years ago, when my mother was preparing a history of Woolsthorpe and I was helping her, one of the things we were delighted to see was this photo in the bottom right. This was a photo taken in 1866. And for me as an ecologist, to suddenly see what this landscape was like in the past was just wonderful, with the trees, the manigums in the background, and the ladies in their full skirts, and the houses with thatched roofs. And then also, this is a photo from a book from 1861 by James Dawson. And this lady here was so-called the chiefess of the Mawpor tribe, lived, and her life was in this same area where I grew up. So we probably walked over the same land. So it's just a rather poignant connection. My starting point tonight is this, the great commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. And as a scientist, I particularly appreciate the love God with all our mind, as well as those other aspects. In Luke's version, this was followed by the one of the scholars of the law asking, and who is my neighbour? And this was really about, this is the key question. This is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Who is my neighbour? And when I was thinking about this, the Good Samaritan is set in a local context, just like many of Jesus' parables were. People would have known the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. The passers-by in the story would have been familiar kind of people that were there. And I wondered about what kind of parable might Jesus say to you or me in our context and life circumstances. Perhaps to you as a teacher or a physiotherapist or an accountant. And I was thinking from an ecological perspective, who is my neighbour? And so thinking ecologically, who is my neighbour? And that's what I want to discuss with you this evening. And here's the take-home points now, in case I'm slow or don't get to them or run out of time. We're ecologically connected with many neighbours at local, regional, national and international scales, and I'll give some examples. I do have, and you do, we all do have a direct effect, for better or worse, and indirect effects on our neighbours near and far. And the cumulative effects from multiple good neighbours can have a really large impact. There's also a temporal component. So my actions can affect neighbours in the future, and that's something for us to think about. And this saying of Jesus, love your neighbour as yourself and go and do likewise, do challenge us to think deeply. I'm not called to solve all the world's environmental problems myself, but my view is that my responsibility is to act with care and compassion in my life and to be part of a society that's responsible and compassionate. So I'll be interested in your thoughts on those. Landscapes. Landscapes are large areas. I think of landscapes as something you see when you're looking out of a plane or looking down from a hilltop. They're heterogeneous, that means they're patchy. They're made up of different land uses. They typically have a strong human influence impact. So landscape ecology is about studying these kinds of broad heterogeneous areas and their human impact and their ecology. That's their plants and animals and how the system works. So it's at a large scale. It's a growing discipline. It has wide application in land management and in planning and conservation. I like to think we're solutions focused and also take a holistic perspective. The landscape has emergent properties. It's more than just the sum of the individual bits. And there's lots of different kinds of landscapes. And here's some examples from all around the world. Top left from New Hampshire, looking out at the White Mountains, a largely natural landscape. Top right, the big desert in Victoria after a fire. And you can see the patchiness created by the fire and the unburnt areas and the burnt areas and little islands of unburnt. And so you can see some previous fire scars here creating patchiness. Agricultural landscapes all over the world are heterogeneous. Farmland areas, bits of natural vegetation, wetlands, places where people live, and then cities and urban towns likewise. So landscapes are heterogeneous. How do we understand them? Well, we can think about them in terms of a framework of structure and function and change. And if we look at the landscape like this from north central Victoria, in terms of structure, we can see different kinds of components in the landscape. The vineyard down the bottom here, the farmhouses and dwellings here, some plantings and revegetation here, roadside strips of trees, paddocks of different sorts through there. We can think about the function. Function refers to the movements and flows. So the farmer taking water out to troughs and stock, or moving fertilisers onto paddocks and harvesting grain and taking it back in, water flowing through the landscape. These are all aspects of function. And then it changes over time. This vineyard in the front here is relatively recent. It's only in the last about 20 years, and there's been other changes in that landscape as well. And these relate to each other. So structure is about the components and the spatial relationships in a landscape. Function is about how it works, movements and flows that interact between the different spatial elements, and it changes in time. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, it's to give you a bit of background to thinking about ecological connections. Who is my ecological neighbour? And we're connected with other people through changes that I might make to landscape structure that then affect other people's environment and life experience. We're connected where there are movements or flows between different areas, that perhaps between where I am and where somebody else is. And we're also connected where my actions might, or the things I do might affect the the future circumstances or the environment of other people. And I'd like to look at some of these. The question is, how might my actions affect my neighbours? We talk about ecosystem services as the name given to the benefits that nature provides for people, for human society. And there are 4 broad categories that are mentioned, that are used. And you can see some examples here and others in that chart. And so when my actions or my group's actions or my community's actions affect the ecosystem services available to other people, I am altering and changing their environment and what supports their life, for better or worse. Provisioning, so things like food and water and timber that are produced from the environment. Regulating services, so things like vegetation that controls floods along streams, clean air, pollination by birds and birds and insects and other pollinators. Cultural benefits, places to enjoy for recreation or for inspiration or for theological reflection. Conserving species that we get pleasure from knowing are there. And then supporting factors, things that are necessary for producing ecosystem services. So the formation of soils that produce the food that we eat, habitats that support the biodiversity, plants and animals that provide other services, and so on. So who are my ecological neighbours? Let me give you an example, starting off via connections and movement. So I'll take you up here to north central Victoria. My family owns a block of land up here, and it's around where that arrow is there, the end of that arrow there, in here, and there's a vineyard opposite, and you can see lots of farmland, and this is part of the Rushworth State Forest in here. And I go there when I can and really enjoy being there. It's good for my soul. How am I connected? Well, there's local movements, and most of my examples tonight relate to wildlife because that's my area of interest. There's local movements across land boundaries. This might be private land boundaries, or it might be across land boundaries of different tenure, public or private, national parks or state forests. I've recorded about 90 bird species on this on the block, but any particular time there's only 20 or 30, and the others are coming and going. They're there at times. Some of the local residents move around, so things like white-winged choughs occur in large flocks, and they occupy a large area that crosses over between the boundary between our place and the neighbour's place. So in that sense, I'm providing habitat, and therefore I'm a neighbour for the adjacent block, and vice versa. The habitat that they provide supports the choughs and the kookaburras that come onto my place, and I get the benefit and appreciate that, and it makes my well-being much better. Likewise, things like eastern grey kangaroos that move around, and also things like large tree goannas. And there can also be negative effects. One of the adjacent landholders put out some rabbit traps, and he trapped and killed a large tree goanna that was wandering around my property as well. So I've lost that. The actions of the neighbour can be to the detriment of my enjoyment of the environment in where I live. The same will be for you, for whether if you live in an urban street or wherever you are, there will be local movements and flows between you and between adjacent people living there. And it might be movements of wildlife. So where I live, things like brush-tailed possums, one of our urban wildlife, our New Zealand friends may not be so keen on them. Eastern spinebills, it can be a lot of delight when they come to the grevilleas that are flowering, and they move around between different house blocks over a substantial area. We also connected via flows of weeds move, seeds are blown, fertilisers, sounds between neighbours, airflow and smoke if we have an incinerator. That's why we're not allowed to have incinerators in urban areas. Flows of water. So these are many ways in which we can be connected ecologically with other people, in this case, quite near to us. But up in this block, I'm also connected at a regional scale with movements of birds in particular. Nectar feeders like musk lorikeets and red wattlebirds move across other areas of forest when it's flowering and move backwards and forwards between urban Melbourne. There's tens of thousands of red wattlebirds move from some of these forests up here down to urban Melbourne and back at times. Some bird species like pied currawongs are moving seasonally between the Great Dividing Range here and out into the more open areas during the winter months. Golden whistlers, white-naped honeyeaters are others. So in that way, my block is connected with the forests and the public land off the Great Dividing Range. The dam on my property is visited occasionally by a little pied cormorant, and it also moves between other wetlands in the local area. So there's connections in that way as well. So I'm connected at regional scales with other people. I'm also connected at national, even international scales. Rainbow bee eaters and sacred kingfishers, which turn up in the spring and summer months, migrate to and from Northern Australia, and some even migrate to Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. The swift parrot, one of our endangered species in Australia, migrates between Tasmania, where it breeds in the forest nests down there during the spring and summer months, and then migrates across to the mainland and moves around quite broadly, particularly through north central Victoria, where it feeds over the autumn and winter months. I've had swift parrots, this internationally critically endangered species, on my property, and so I like to think that in some way at times I contribute to the continued existence of this threatened species and the pleasure it gives to bird observers all over Australia and people who are interested in the conservation of our threatened species. We're also connected internationally, not my block personally, but through birds that migrate between Australia and New Zealand and the Northern Hemisphere. And one example is this one here, the far eastern curlew. It's a shorebird. You can see that long bill that it uses for probing down in the sand and the mud to collect invertebrate prey. You can see here this plot showing the change in abundance of the eastern curlews in Australia and New Zealand over the last decades, and it's a precipitous decline. Something dramatic is happening. And the issue is that when it migrates from Australia, where it occurs in the non-breeding season, up to the Northern Hemisphere where it breeds, it has stopover points along the way as it flies. And one of the critical stopover points is here in the Yellow Sea between Korea and China. And the land reclamation along the coasts here is removing this stopover habitat where the curlews can stop for some days and feed up ravenously and fuel up, build up muscle and fat, and then fly on for the last part of the journey. So here's an example where we as Australians and New Zealanders are connected internationally via the movements of this species, but the consequences of other people, our internationally connected neighbours, changing the environment there are having an effect on the curlews that we see here in Australia and New Zealand. That's a bit about flows and movements and the connections. I'd like to talk about this second one is about when we change the structure of the landscape, we can affect others. One of my group's research interest is in how species respond to whole landscapes. One of the issues we've been carrying out research on is the value of revegetation, like this you can see here on farms in southwestern Victoria. And we selected a large number of different blocks of landscape, each 8 square kilometres in size, 800 hectares, typically representing several farms, or several farms are represented on them. Some of these had native remnant vegetation, some had revegetation alone, and some had mixtures. But let me talk about those with revegetation. And they look a little bit like this, a circular landscape that we study, and the black dots are where we've carried out bird surveys at 12 points. And here's one with very little vegetation on it. This one's got a little bit, this dark green. This one here has got a bit more. You can see these dark green blocks are where there's been blocks of revegetation on different farms. And some of these lines are revegetated shelter belts. The lighter shading green is just scattered paddock trees through the farmland. So we surveyed birds on each of these landscapes, and we're asking, what is it about a landscape that best explains the variation in the number of bird species that occur there? And the result is the strongest predictor is the total amount of wooded cover in the landscape. And here the total amount of wooded cover is by summing all of these areas, dark green areas here, adding up the different bits on different properties planted by different people, adds up to the sum of the vegetation in the landscape. So in this case, each of the landholders contributes to that total effect in the landscape, and in that way are making a better outcome for all. It's the cumulative effects of different people doing something, changing the structure on their property, changes the structure of the whole landscape, and the birds are responding to that whole landscape structure, and everybody benefits in that way from the cumulative effects of what lots of people are doing. Neighbours working on their own properties, having benefits for themselves, but also enhancing the environment for their direct neighbours and for the wider community through the conservation of bird species that it supports in that area, and then can spill over into other regional areas as well. There's other similar kind of examples, water flows and stream systems. The combined effects of multiple landholders who hold land along that stream determine the quality of the water downstream that many others will experience. And if one landholder decided they were going to clear and cut down trees and then resulted in erosion and runoff into the stream, that would mean sediment would run downstream and affect many other people, a detrimental effect on ecologically connected neighbours that may be kilometres away. Urban areas, what you do, those of us who live in an urban area, what you do on your property contributes to the urban landscape. One of my PhD students, Jacinta, is studying birds in urban landscapes, areas of 1 square kilometre, and the most important predictors of the diversity of bird species in urban landscapes is the total amount of tree cover and also the total housing cover. So retaining trees on your individual block contributes to the wider good of the whole landscape, and many others benefit as well. If you like me, admire the work of Tony Ronaldo in Niger to start with farmer managed natural regeneration. This is landscape ecology in action. Have a look here. You can see the changing the structure of the landscape by retaining, allowing trees to grow, or growing new trees, alters the structure, which then alters the function in that landscape, the flow of water, the trapping and holding of nutrients in the soil, and we see a benefit in terms of plant growth. The cumulative effect of that across the landscape can be enormous, such that you can look down on a Google Earth image of Niger and see the transformation of landscape from the multiple actions of lots of individual people changing the structure in their landscape, and that resulting in widespread national benefits. Thinking about the future, where my actions affect my neighbour's future. Did you realise in the parable of the Good Samaritan, there's a temporal component? When I went back and read it carefully again, the Good Samaritan took the injured man to the inn, He stayed overnight with him. He paid the innkeeper to look after him for some time. He gave 2 silver coins. Not sure exactly how much that was, but one commentary suggested it would pay for many nights' accommodation. And the Samaritan said he'd come back, and the next time he was coming past, he'd pay additional costs. It wasn't just a static helping him there and then and off he went. There was a temporal component. In the same way, the things that you and I do can affect our neighbour's future. Many long-lasting processes that we may be involved in, or our group, or our society, can have long-lasting effects that will affect our neighbours for decades or even centuries to come. Chemicals entering the food chain, land degradation, the spread of noxious weeds, and so on. But it can also have really positive effects. The regeneration of trees. It'll take many decades for these young trees to reach the size of this large old tree here along this regenerating creekline area. Trees that protect streams and over time will gradually improve the aquatic environment and the quality of the water. Getting rid of pest plants and animals has wider benefits long into the future. On our block up in north central Victoria, one of the things I'm grateful for is that when it was first cleared for farmland, it's regenerating bushland over about the last 40 years. They didn't clear everything, but there's still some of these big old trees. This is a magnificent pre-European grey box tree. And it gives me a great deal of pleasure to have it. And it's also responsible for things like this yellow-footed antechinus and brown tree creeper that need hollows in trees, assist them to be present on the property. Our societal obligations. I've talked a fair bit about just as individuals, but we're part of a society, we're part of a community. If we are to love our neighbour as ourselves, what does that mean about the kind of environment we pass on? What does it say about extinctions of species or pollution of air and water and land for generations to come, or climate change? As I said, I grew up in Woolsthorpe in Western Victoria, and there was none of this past to be able to see what the land was once like. I didn't inherit that from my neighbours in the past. My parents spoke about the eastern barred bandicoot being common. I never saw them. They disappeared from the area in about 1946. They're almost extinct in Victoria and hang on in Tasmania. I have up on my wall this John Gould painting of the white-footed rabbit rat. I think it's a lovely painting. It's totally extinct, globally extinct. This photo here by my colleague Lindy Lumsden is the Christmas Island Pipistrelle. This is our most recent extinction. This one's happened on our watch in 2009. Lindy was there when the last recordings or sounds of this Pipistrelle were recorded, and it's never been heard since. Here's one that's still around. Brush-tailed phascagar was a fascinating small marsupial. This is one of the species that one of my research students is working on, and we like to think that we can, through providing knowledge, can contribute to a species like this being around for people to enjoy in years to come. What's my responsibility? What's your responsibility? What's our responsibility? Well, Jesus said, love your neighbour as yourself, and you go and do likewise, when he referred to the Samaritan. I guess my thesis is that caring for our neighbour, loving our neighbour is much more than simply direct person-to-person relationships, but the way in which each of us interact with the environment, how we affect the environment for other people, and how we affect the environment for people into the future. And that can be both for good and for bad. What's my responsibility? Well, here's some summary points, I think. First is simply to be more aware of neighbours near and far, and the direct and the indirect effects that we have on them. to act with care and compassion where and how I can. The Good Samaritan helped the person he met. He didn't set up a society to benefit travellers from Jerusalem to Jericho. It was meeting the need was there in front of him. And I think that's the immediate challenge for each of us, to deal with or respond to needs where we can. To realise that what I do matters, even though I might be one individual, the cumulative impacts of many people being good neighbours can have a powerful effect. And also to work as part of society, community groups, agencies, government, so that neighbours near and far have a quality environment to which you and I aspire. And in the first one in this series, Philip Hughes gave many great examples of ways in which we can be involved in wider groups. Perhaps my last point to challenge myself and to challenge you is this one, that in Jesus's parable, when the people heard it, it would have been shocking to them. So many of Jesus' teachings were that a despised Samaritan was a good neighbour. I wonder what we might find shocking if Jesus was to tell us a parable today about loving our neighbours where we live and how we live. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your years of experience and prompting us to think about the parables of Jesus in a different sort of a way. Now, we have one question here from John House. I'll ask John if you're there, John.
Well, first of all, thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. I agree with your points about how movements cross boundaries and how we need to look at the whole, and also how we deal with injury. But if you look at the parable in Luke, it starts with a robber stealing something. And if you want to change the question from who is my neighbour to who is my ecological neighbour, then is that question not something that one should start with? What has been stolen in the ecological wholeness, and who has been injured? Now, in New Zealand, that would be Maori. In Australia, that would be Aborigine. And so if you're going to think about the ecological wholeness, then you need to, I suggest, include not just the current owners, but also thinking about who, what and who had things stolen from them, and how in the end, as it were, do you compensate that and bring them into an active participation in the ecological system?
They're good points, John. I guess I wasn't trying to take the analogy too closely, but you're right. I think what is being stolen is the quality of the life, the quality environment. As you're saying, with Maori and with Aboriginal people, obviously much more than that. The whole land, the existence, the culture, all of those things have been taken and have been stolen. Yes, one could look. I won't go down that pathway too much, but clearly that's there as well. But I guess in terms of the present day right now, my analogy is that we can steal, we can take away from the pleasure that other people have, a cultural aspect. We can take away from the ability of other people to have food or to have clean water. We can take away in a sense, the future. Some people have argued that through what we're doing now and the way we change the world with climate change, in a sense, we're stealing or taking part of the future. And some have said, you know, one of the 10 Commandments is "Thou shalt not steal," and we're stealing the future from others. I also think about, and this is one of the more diffuse ones, that and the broader connections that are hard to grapple with. But I like chocolate. I drink coffee. We get coffee and chocolate from other countries. A colleague was telling me recently that the land that's on which cocoa beans are produced, or cocoa is in West Africa, has doubled since the year 2000. And a lot of that is from clearing rainforest to make new land. So am I, through my consumption of chocolate, somehow stealing from people in another land in another place who are certainly far more impoverished than I am? Those are the things that really challenge my thinking, and I don't have answers to them, but I think that, to me, that's where some of the comparison of the theft comes in. The way we're taking away from the well-being and the quality of life that others might experience.
Peter Fagg, you've got a question.
G'day, Andrew. Thanks for that talk. All very very clear and with lots of good examples. I just, it's sort of a bit of a point here. I want to clear up. My question is, at Woolsthorpe, that you had a photo there taken in 1866. It must have been really at the start of where photos were being taken. But did you imply that the settlers had cleared the trees there?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So there were trees around there. That the grassland plains were further north. So that was manna gums and
Red gum
and others around there. Yeah, and so that was entirely that area. There's one small remnant still remains there. So that was entirely cleared. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm familiar with the the large basalt plain of the Western District. Yeah. I thought that Woolsthorpe was part of that. Not so?
No, it's on the edge of that. The trees, as you gradually go further north up towards Mortlake, the tree density would have become thinner, and then there would have been grasslands. But you could actually say the same thing, Peter, because we have something like 95 or 98% of the native grasslands have also been cleared and disappeared across that basalt plain. So in the same sense, we've lost the native vegetation that was there. It hasn't been handed on to our generation. Yeah.
Charles, you have a provocative question there, don't you?
Thanks for a great talk, Andrew, about ecological neighbours. And just thinking, how best to help them with, say, you talked about wooded area. My logic is that if the globe warms up, several things happen. They've talked about glaciers melting, which means all that fresh water that at present is lying around doing nothing will be back in the water cycle, evaporating, condensing, and then raining. You'll have more rain around the world, which means more fertility, more wooded cover for birds, more ability to grow food for humans. So as part of our loving neighbours and being good ecological neighbours, should be promoting global warming that could increase the amount of rain and have all the other good effects.
Curly one. My response, Charles, would be that with the predictions for global warming is there's going to be winners and losers. And so while there might be increased rainfall in some areas, there's certainly going to be greatly decreased rainfall in other areas. And one of the factors that we're told is associated with global warming is the increased amount of extreme events. And so we've seen that in Australia in just recent years, floods, bushfires. Now, the extent to which they're directly attributable to global warming is that that's a debatable matter, but it ties in with the predictions that we're going to get more extreme events. Personally, while there might be some winners, I think the the likely to be lots more losers and some pretty horrific outcomes for parts of the world. So I think one has to look at the net benefits and losses, or benefit gains and losses across the globe.
Yep, that's true. Yeah, I'm questioning the majority opinion that there will be more losers than winners if the globe warms. Because I think with the more rain, that would give a lot more benefits than you'd have in losers. Like the more evaporation under a warmer earth would tend to lower sea levels with more water going up into the atmosphere, balancing the more water flowing in from melting glaciers. I haven't seen people thinking about that. If we are going to be good ecological neighbours, I think one of your points was we need to think a lot better and a lot straighter.
That's right, and there's lots of research looking at the potential effects. You know, in my area of wildlife ecology and conservation, there's certainly a lot of evidence that already distributions of species are changing. The parts of the existing ranges of species will likely be unsuitable soon. We're potentially face local extinctions and global extinctions when environments no longer become suitable and species don't have the capacity to move. So there's going to be all sorts of potential effects that are there. Look, I might leave it at that, and if anybody else would like to contribute to that debate, they're welcome to do so.
Thanks, Andrew. We don't have any more questions in the chat, but Andrew's invited us to contribute to that conversation that we've just been having. Go ahead, John, and then we'll hear from you, Brian.
It's not just the glaciers that are melting, it's also Antarctic. The evidence there is pretty frightening in terms of sea level rise. The whole question of the water cycle is much more complicated than simply making land more fertile, because of the sea level rise is coming predicted to what the scientists are telling us from the Antarctic. Not only will it inundate a lot of land, but with the extreme events, the land that you want to grow trees on, Charles, won't be there because a lot of it is flood prone. That would be my take in terms of thinking about the pluses and the minuses of the water cycle.
Thanks, John. Over to you, Brian.
Yes, well, thank you, Andrew, for that presentation. I think what I find is that what you were saying was that one of the principles of Barry Commoner, the ecological principles, was that everything is connected to everything else. Yep. And what concerns me is the international dimension of all this. To just mention that the possibility that sea levels will rise, we will have people putting up their hands for become refugees. And the other thing is that everything's connected to everything else because, you know, our aid in Australia has gone down dramatically and nobody's putting their hand up about it. And the government just getting away with less and less and less help in situations where they need more and more help because they didn't cause the climate change problems. But they're having to pay the effect because their governments can't afford to offset the problems. I worked in East Africa for 26 years as an agricultural missionary, and I was always asked to help them plant trees. When I would ask why, they would say, well, this climate change thing is coming and we know that trees will absorb the carbon and we want to protect ourselves from the problems. But I was so embarrassed because I know that we contributed an enormous amount to the problem and they nothing, and they can't afford it. So the question comes back to, what do we mean about international neighbours? And I wondered if you'd thought much about that one, because I'm struggling with that.
Yeah, indeed, Brian. it's a hard one. This is, I wasn't quite sure what the correct term was. It's certainly not a direct neighbour, but it's maybe an indirect neighbour, or even diffuse sort of neighbourhood effects that we as a Western society are having. You know, rich Western society, the way we've lived, does affect the environment for the rest of the world, and this becomes a justice issue. And there's lots of things in the Bible about the Old Testament about living in a just way and caring for others. And as a nation, so it becomes down to sort of, yes, we have individual responsibilities, but as a society and a national responsibility, there's much we could do to help and benefit our international geographic neighbours. I think particularly of the Pacific nations that are our geographic neighbours, PNG and Fiji and Solomon Islands and so on. And our international aid budget just goes down and down, and yet we are affecting their future through things like the carbon in the atmosphere and climate change and what might happen with rising sea levels and so on. So absolutely agree with you. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. Margot, I wonder if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, I am living in Halls Gap in the Grampians National Park. And so those of us who live in regional things, I think it's really important that we take part in group activities like land care, like friends groups for the national park, etc. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, Halls Gap's a lovely place where you're living, Margot. I think there's lots of benefits, and so this is where we need to think of this at my responsibility as an individual and how I can do things as part of a community or a group, as well as at a governmental level as a society. And so the organisations like Landcare and Friends of National Parks and Friends Off Group do a wonderful job, and there are ways in which people can work together as a community to address those sorts of issues, and at the same time get a lot of positive return from doing it. It's the sort of second example I was trying to give of where people are working together, multiple neighbours working together in those sorts of ways can have benefits way beyond what individuals can do, and that's absolutely to be supported and encouraged and appreciated. And there's also growing evidence of the psychological value to people of A, being out in the environment and doing things, and B, actually being part of groups that are doing things together in the environment, that it's actually good for us psychologically as well.
Thanks, Margot. Thanks, Andrew. Peter, have another go.
Well, I thought I would, given that not everybody, not a lot of people are asking questions, Andrew, but my comment is the availability of carbon credits for new areas of trees in Australia is a positive move, I believe, and should help the landscape in terms of either plantations or, well, could be other ways that trees are established. Any comment?
Yeah, I agree. We know that there's lots of areas where we'd like to get more trees or more native vegetation back in the landscape. I guess I'd be thinking of biodiverse plantings rather than monocultures, and that's going to have multiple benefits. One of the problems is that we've seen with the kind of voluntary take up via land care and other things like that, it takes an enormous effort to change a substantial part of the landscape. So an area in, I'm trying to think of the name, in Western Australia in the wheat belt, where there was a huge effort over many years and CSIRO people doing studies there. And after 10 or 15 years, the Tamman Land Care Group area there, I think they'd increased the tree cover by about 3 or 4%. Similarly, up in Murrumbidgee area in New South Wales, massive effort has increased by about 2%. So to bring about dramatic changes, there needs to be some sort of commercial basis to it, I think is what we're learning. And so carbon credits is a way of providing a commercial return for that large-scale revegetation, while it's also having ecological benefits for the environment in all sorts of ways. And when it's done in a coordinated way, thinking about networks of habitat and along stream systems as well as flocks, that's going to have many landscape benefits as well. Yeah, so I agree.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Peter. Jill's got a question there.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Andrew. I just wondered if you have any thoughts about native versus introduced species with regards to ecological neighbours and neighbourhoods.
The native species is what we'd certainly like to encourage. That's what we appreciate, that it has conservation benefits. Planting native species adds to the habitat in terms of ecosystem services. It's a positive for society and for neighbours. Introduced species often are problematic because they can have all sorts of detrimental effects, whether it's weeds that can affect agricultural properties if they spread. Neighbours don't like having thistles and other noxious weeds spreading between direct neighbours. Foxes, rabbits, pigs, those sorts of exotic pest species are also problematic, and they don't go along with being good neighbours if you're the person who's allowing them to spread from your property. And in fact, that's part of the legislation. There's a requirement for people, for landholders, to reduce or to control some of these pest species on their property. So yes, I'd be all for native species, and I'm not keen on introduced species.
I was thinking in regards to farms and revegetating properties, and what are most farmers using? You know, how do they decide that sort of thing? And I can fully understand that native vegetation is the ideal, but I'm wondering about the benefits perhaps of non-native. And the other thing I just wanted to ask you about was genetically modified plants, how that kind of fits in with what you're thinking.
The first one about the planting and revegetation and restoration, sorry, I hadn't realised that's what you're meaning. There's different views on that. There's a growing awareness and growing trend towards planting native species, but in southwestern Victoria, where we're doing this work, you sort of see some of the history of that. So, you know, going back 40, 50 years or even longer, there were lots of plantations of sugar gums, which were local indigenous, pines, cypresses. Then people in about the 1970s started planting or learning about planting native trees, and a lot of those early ones included eucalypts from Western Australia and things like that, and they're there and growing, and they flower. They provide flowering at different times of the year, and some of our work shows that the birds are responding to the diversity of plants in these plantings. And I think that's partly because you get a greater structural diversity and you get different food sources through the year. But one of the things I'd comment is that planting those is unlikely to be self-sustaining in the long term because they're not adapted to that local environment. So they're less likely to seed and have future generations, whereas the locally indigenous native ones are more likely to be self-sustaining. And I guess just from a philosophical perspective, it's you know, we like to think we're putting back what was there rather than introducing something different and something new to the environment. Genetically modified. Not sure whether I'm qualified to talk about this. I know there have been concerns, I think it was in Western Australia, with some genetically modified strains of canola, was it? Led to legal suits between farmer neighbours because of the blowing and the spread and the cross-pollination and certainly there will be cross-pollination, so there can be spread. I probably don't know enough to go too far in saying, commenting on whether that's good or bad. Yeah.
G'day, Andrew. Graham McLean up in Wagga Wagga. Terrific presentation. Thank you very much indeed. I think we all need to hear it often and take it very seriously. I had a couple of questions. One, a tiny technical question. When you were talking about revegetation of landscape, and you said that the key consideration is total amount of wooded cover. Just to clarify, does that mean that it doesn't matter how few pockets there are if they're sufficiently concentrated, they would be as beneficial as a widely distributed mix of cover? Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. So, and this holds also with remnant native vegetation. So when we first started doing this work, looking at the whole of landscape, we expected that what would be really important would be what we call the configuration, whether there's lots of small patches versus one large one, how they're spatially set out. But at this landscape scale, the strongest correlations, the strongest in terms of statistical models, was with the total amount. If you add up that total amount, and it didn't really, no, it mattered a little bit, but it was that total amount that was important, rather than it having to be all big blocks or all one block here or there. And that was quite surprising, because a lot of the literature suggests that the more fragmented and broken up the landscape is, the less value it'll have. But I think that's because usually where you get more fragmented and broken up landscapes, you actually have less total cover.
Yeah.
And so it's that total amount that does seem to be, other things add to that, Graham, but it's that total amount does seem to be important. Yeah.
Very interesting. But it means that a farmer could say, okay, I'm going to concentrate this paddock or this creek line with pretty densely wooded cover, and I more or less got free rein for the rest of my property, so long as that would give me give the landscape as much total wooded cover as a more widely distributed cover would do.
Yeah, I'm talking about the percentage of the landscape, that is the percentage of the land area that is covered, rather than the
oh, I see. So it's not the amount of
vegetation
as such.
Of the trees, no.
Okay, sorry.
So it's 10% or 20% of the landscape is covered, and that 20% of the landscape cover might be made up of little bits here and there, or in the case of these revegetated landscapes, often it's little shelter belts and little bits, little patches here and there. Yeah,
I see. No, that helps, because I misunderstood that, because you had in your diagrams and maps, you had some comparisons between sparser cover and more dense cover, and then you said it was a question of the little bits, and I misread little bits to mean actually amounts of vegetation as such, rather than amount of land. So that's important. Yeah.
There's actually a much more complex story that I was skating over quite quickly. And on those diagrams, part of it is some of those farms also have scattered trees, those quite widely spaced scattered trees, and they also contribute because they soften the landscape and support movements through it. So they can be really important as well.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Andrew, for that. I admire you from afar and close at hand. My question relates to the national scale and the national policy regarding land clearance. There seems to be a terrifying loss of forests and natural landscape, particularly in Queensland at the moment. So there is sort of an urgency for doing something about this, or trying to influence our political betters.
Thanks, Pete. And Pete's a close friend, so it's lovely to see you there, Pete. It's still something we need to do a lot better at. It was only about a decade or so ago that in Queensland we had land clearance of something like 500,000 hectares a year. We were right up there on a par with Brazil and other countries in terms of the amount of land clearing of trees and forests that we were doing. We have had legislation in South Australia was first, Victoria and New South Wales, to prevent clearing of trees or that can only be under permit. I don't think it's in Queensland. It just seems kind of ironic that at the same time as we're having trees cleared, we're investing many millions and millions of dollars in tree planting and revegetation and restoration. I don't have an answer to it. I think it's there's a growing change of public understanding and awareness that putting back trees is more valuable, losing trees. But there's still also the debate about if this is my property, if I'm not allowed to clear trees on my property, that can affect my livelihood. The balance about what's the role of society versus an individual landholder in doing those sorts of things.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. That provides more balance.
Yeah, one of the things I think has been really encouraging is land care. You know, it was a significant change in about 25, 30 years ago in Australia anyway, where the Australian Conservation Foundation and the National Farmers Federation, the two leaders of that were good friends, and they came together, and that's where land care started. And that's where government has invested more and more of the environmental funds. Sometimes it's because they want to bypass state governments and they want to go more direct to the ground. But that growth in land care and the involvement in land care and people working together, I think has been one of the significant achievements in Australia in the last 50 years, and to be encouraged.
Thank you. Graham, your next question.
This is a big question, Andrew, and you've already touched upon it a good deal, but I was just really inviting you to say a little more. I think your emphasis on the parable of the Good Samaritan is dead right, and when we take it seriously in the ways that you're saying, the implications are so very enormous for us all that there's all sorts of human tendencies to hold it at bay and deceive ourselves about its not applying to us and so on. But if we can put those tendencies aside and take it seriously, as Christians, the opposite problem is to be overwhelmed to the point of paralysis, especially if we think about what's happening on a global scale. And if what emerges from the parable is that the neighbour whom I have a duty to love is someone who's in need, even though I'm not responsible for his being in need, but I encounter him and I'm in a position to help. If we put that into the 21st century, well, we know of countless people who are in need for whom we may not, in fact, be responsible for their need, but we know of them through the media and everything else. We are in a position to help, and the problem can just seem utterly overwhelming, paralytically overwhelming.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Graham, and that's one I particularly thought long and hard about in preparing this talk. What do I say? What is my as an individual, you and I, what is our responsibility? Because it can be overwhelming, as you say, and is overwhelming. And I don't know about you've been an academic and a teacher, and we're seeing more of younger people, eco-anxiety, and we had with our research lab group, we had a meeting and discussion about this, where some of the PhD students and research fellows were feeling overwhelmed with what's happening ecologically in the world. It was a somewhat flippant comment, but I think it's the best I can get at, was the Samaritan responded to what was in front of him. Yeah. The need that was there. The Samaritan didn't feel an obligation to set up a society to protect all travellers from Jerusalem to Jericho or do that. It was responding to a need that was there. And to me, that's a starting point, that if I individually respond in the way that I can, that is within my capacity, to me, that's a starting point in my responsibility as a Christian. But the second step perhaps then is that Philip Hughes spoke about beautifully the first week of this series about all of the different organisations that are doing things, and there's ways in which whether it's I forget the name of saying before, and from Hall's Gap was saying being part of local groups. We might physically be part of local groups, we might physically be involved in tree planting, or we might support them financially or morally, or in my case, part of my responsibility is through research and knowledge, and part of my responsibility is not just to publish in journals, but to try and communicate to people so that it's meaningful in a way that people can use. That's the best I can do, or my approach to it, Graham, is thinking about what can we do when we're confronted with something that we can respond to. And yeah.
I think that's very helpful, Andrew. And I'd just say, I think you're right to stress that the body of Christ, the different members who have different gifts and different insights, have a responsibility to be working together here and encouraging one another to act both collectively but individually in our different ways, as we, as a body, much better than individuals, survey the whole scene and all the needs. But anyway, that's to state the obvious, really, but it's important. Anyway, thank you very much indeed. It needs to be discussed constantly, I think.
Yeah. The one I just showed briefly, because it is the work that Tony Ronaldo's done, initially in Niger. There was an individual loving his neighbour as an individual to the farmers, and the consequence of that is, and I think that's God working in that situation, of a whole new approach to natural regeneration that's benefited lots of individuals. And now the Christian group World Vision, Tony's employed with World Vision, and that same approach is being used around the world, and having all sorts of benefits to people in many countries around the world. I think that illustrates what you're saying.
Thank you.
Andrew, do you want to answer Julian's question in the chat about significant natural areas?
No, we don't have significant natural areas like that. We in a bird sense, we have what are they called? IBAs, important bird areas, but we don't have significant natural areas. I'm assuming by significant natural area, meaning areas that are recognised as important, but they may not be national parks or reserves. It's more a general landscape or something. Is that right?
I think that's right, yes. Bernadette, why don't you go next, because you haven't asked a question yet.
Oh, thank you. Firstly, Andrew, Woolsthorpe, I know Woolsthorpe because I lived in Killarney in the Western District.
There you go.
So there you go. And you're a real Western Victorian, very down to earth. And I love that conversation you have with Graham, because that was after watching Four Corners on Monday night about the climate change, particularly in British Columbia, and what was going on right around the world. And I thought, if you had the gift of prophecy, how do you see our planet surviving with all its challenges, both ecologically and environmentally? And I think, we have to believe that the Lord has created this universe. There's a creator out there that loves what he's made, and loves us and loves animals and everything. We're all, as you say, we're all connected. I'm a bit like Graham. You get a bit down the mouth, you try and you little bit, I feel very responsible as a Christian to love my neighbour. I probably don't do it very well, but I try. But I just wondered, do you think on a global basis we'll be okay?
I'm not a prophet, Bernadette.
No.
Look, I guess my response would be to look for the good things. And when you drive around country Victoria, you do see revegetation along creek lines, fenced off, restoration occurring. Good things are happening. We've got to focus on the good things that are there, the beautiful things. That's why I really love getting to our bush block. My two adult sons can just about quote the what's the film, the Castle. They quote slabs of the castle, and our family line is, "Oh, how's the serenity?" when we go to the bush block, and it is. It's great, and when you get out there and you can experience trees around and nature around, and that's the personal way I respond to it is by looking for the good things.
I know,
but that's not to turn a blind eye to the change and the degradation that happens as well.
Thank you, Andrew. It's time to finish. It's time to, John's going to pray for us, but let me say on behalf of everybody else, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and years of experience in a very winsome way. It's been a pleasure to have you tonight. I'm going to invite John Howell to pray to close our time now. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Chris. And can I just add my thanks to Andrew for tonight's presentation. I'm going to finish with a blessing from a book by John O'Donoghue called To Bless the Space Between Us. May all that is unforgiven in you be released. May your fears yield their deepest tranquillities. May all that is unlived in you blossom into a future graced with love. Amen.